Hello, I'm Andrew McPherson at the Centre for Digital Music, Queen Mary University of London, presenting this paper on behalf of my co-author, Giacomo Lepri. In this paper, we ask some fundamental questions about the nature of the creative process when we use digital tools to create musical instruments. And I could start by observing that, on acoustic instruments, we have stringent mechanical limitations, but that with digital tools we could theoretically create any imaginable sound or interactive relationship. Now, this is a common observation at NIME, and I completely disagree with it. It's true, of course, that many audio programming languages are Turing complete, which effectively means that they could implement any possible computation. But, as most people who've attended NIME concerts will attest, quite a lot of digital musical instruments sound rather similar. Now, this too is hardly a new observation. Mark Applebaum's piece Pre-Composition from 2002 is a brilliant send-up of some computer music tropes that you might still recognize.
I don't know. What do you think should happen next then? It could get like distorted and staticky, like. Oh yeah, I like that. Oh yeah, and then we could like send it around like to all the different speakers. It could like the sound could be like flying around like. How many speakers are there? 8. There's 8 speakers, and then let's bring back that tone thing.
It's also been observed before that beginning music technologists often tend to create the same instrumental metaphors, sometimes even to the point of cliché. These include things like theremins, or, more generically, one-to-one XY mappings of parameter spaces, or turning touch-sensing objects into rudimentary keyboards. Emily Dolan has written compellingly about the way that our conception of music itself is tightly bound up in the keyboard as an interface. However, the question remains, if we can truly create any imaginable sound with our digital tools, why do we keep returning to the same sound world over and over again? There are many reasons, of course, but here we focus on one in particular, which is the role of the language. In the 1980s, Miller Puckett created the Max programming language at Earcam, later licensed to Opcode Systems and developed by Cycling 74. 35 years later, it's still going strong, and Miller has also created the open-source PD language, which operates on similar principles. We'll look at PD in particular in this paper. Miller wrote in a 2002 article that Max goes to great lengths to avoid imposing a stylistic bias on the musician's output. I want to propose that, in fact, Max and PD carry very strong biases which shape the instruments that we create with them, even, or perhaps especially, when we're not aware of those biases. We might sum up this situation by quoting Kranzberg, "Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral." Thor Magnusson unpacks some of the hidden biases of musical instruments. For example, the piano keyboard carries knowledge about the nature of music, as does the sequencer and the digital audio workstation. I want to suggest that we could say the same thing about even rudimentary sensors, or about paradigms of audio programming. We could even go so far as to propose that different computer music languages each have their own sound, not because of how they implement their DSP algorithms, but because of the way that they make us think. To investigate this idea further, Giacomo created a compositional game where two musicians sit across from one another and create simple instruments. We use the PD language, running on Bella, with 3 common sensors. The whole activity lasts approximately an hour in several steps. Each participant starts by creating a PD patch using only one sensor. Then, the participants swap places and make another patch using a different sensor, repeating that one further time. At the end of the session, the 3 individual patches are merged together into one final instrument. We ran this game with 7 pairs of participants, and the results were pretty interesting. We'll focus on the single sensor instruments in this paper. Let's hear some examples now. We looked at the overall trends in what people created, and we found that just 3 sound sources were responsible for all of the sonic material in every instrument. These were the sine oscillator, the phaser, which is essentially a non-band-limited sawtooth, and white noise. Some instruments used more than one of these sources, but there were no other sources of sound, for example, no pre-recorded samples and no wavetables. We then looked at the use of controls. For instruments using the potentiometer, it was most often used to control the frequency. The FSR was most often used to control the frequency or the amplitude, and the button was most often used as a keyboard-like trigger, though it was also commonly used to cycle through frequencies. There were a handful of more idiosyncratic uses in each case as well. One other notable finding was the heavy prevalence of continuous linear mappings, as opposed to, for example, logarithmic scales or discretized steps. These results are interesting, particularly when we consider the listening tastes of the participants. Although the participants are interested in many musical genres, the sonic language of their instruments was almost uniformly that of experimental electronics. For example, we don't see the use of samples or the quantization of pitch to a musical scale, with the single exception of a patch stepping through the harmonic series. We also don't see the tropes associated with beat-based electronic music, for example, rhythmic patterns or step sequencers. And our question is, why not? One factor is probably the short length of this exercise, but in a way this actually underlines our point. The instruments the participants have created may or may not reflect their ideal musical statement, but it does reflect what is easily achievable with PD in a limited time frame. Our suggestion is that even with a longer development time, these idiomatic patterns of the language will continue to exert an aesthetic influence on the creative process. It's also worth noting that the influence of a language is not merely technical. David Ziccarelli points out the important role of community in how people choose and use their tools, which if anything is more important now than it was in 2002. Going back then to Miller's 2002 paper, he writes that it may be impossible to make culturally neutral tools. We completely agree with this. He also says that we might want to keep peeling back layers to try to reach progressively more fundamental assumptions. Here I disagree. The point of this talk is not to pick on Max or PD. On the contrary, these are incredible achievements that have changed the face of digital music. But I propose that in large part it's because of their stylistic assumptions that these languages are so compelling. Along these lines, I want to present to you a gallery of terrible instruments. Here's a terrible church organ. Here's a terrible drummer. And here's a really terrible orchestra. But, of course, the Hammond organ, the 808, and the Commodore 64 have all become influential in their own musical communities precisely for that terribleness, which we might think of as their character. Our proposal for NIME, therefore, is to stop trying to create one more generic audio toolbox that does the same things as previous toolboxes, but in a more neutral way. Rather, we argue for embracing and even emphasizing the wonkiness and weirdness of our tools, recognizing that the uses of technology are none other than what that technology creates for itself. In this way, we should think of instrument design as a kind of artistic conversation across distance between luthier and tool creators, and, as in the case of Max and PD, the creators of popular tools may indirectly turn out to be some of the most influential musicians of our time.